Whereabouts?
And then once that person's
So, despite Jodie giving me an alternative title for my talk tonight, I've given it the somewhat cheeky title of "It's what you do with it that counts." But before we kick into that, let's tell you a little bit about myself. So, as Jodie says, I'm Rob Cowell. I'm the Senior Salesforce Developer at the Bank of Montreal's Asset Management Group. Been working with Salesforce for about 8 years now in various roles, contracting, consulting, end users and everything in between. What I want to talk to you about tonight is enterprise IT and how we can fit public cloud APIs into that world and kind of drive things in today's kind of API economy. So most large enterprise organizations tend to have the same sort of common functions within their business. You've got legal, finance, HR, marketing, etc., etc. So what I'm hoping to be able to illustrate to you tonight is that even with that kind of unglamorous world, there's a lot of innovation opportunities there through commoditized IT. But what does that corporate speak actually mean, innovation through commoditization? To answer that, I'm going to take you back to the root of all IT problems, the users. Now, I think, being a dev group, I think we can all generally agree on the fact that universally, users are at heart a pain in the arse. So when it comes to user requirements, you've got impossible deadlines, you've got ever-changing requirements, monolithic tasks. But then, if you take a step back, are they actually asking for anything that we haven't already seen before? I contend that most enterprise systems are generally a solved problem and have been for the last decade and a half. So for every business need that tends to come up in a large enterprise, it's already been done. It might not necessarily be specific to the individual business and across the whole board of everything they want to solve. But you can make a reasonable assumption that at any given point, a developer's poured his heart and soul into solving that problem and getting a solution ready with code. So what we have now is a legacy of plug-in components and solutions on demand. So this tends to manifest itself in the form of APIs in our cloud world, particularly around Salesforce. They're always on, they're scalable, they're cheap, mostly, and they're targeted and focused on solving a very specific need, ready for someone to come and tie that all together. Now, as a philosophy, that's not particularly new. It's kind of the foundation of how Unix started, and that's to have one tool that does a job very well, and that's kind of the only thing it does, and then you tie things together. So for the Linux and Unix people in the room, you're piping the output of one command into the input of the next command and processing it through a chain. So the notion that an API can expose the rich functionality in this reusable way is a long established approach. What changes it is the network, the connectivity. So getting all of these off-the-shelf pieces to work together and talk to each other and play nicely. So while we're not quite there with the always-on connectivity myth that a lot of these sort of big cloud players would have us believe, and I've written a lot of code in train tunnels, or tried to, what we are seeing is enough level of availability that we can start sort of scaling these things out and having scale of sort of global data centers and transport our information from one API to the next to build out our solutions. Now, we have a tendency to laud these APIs themselves and those that create them, but in pragmatic terms, there's still a lot of skill involved in selecting those APIs and knowing what to do with them and tying them together to make them greater than the sum of their parts. So to draw upon a reasonably familiar analogy, you admire the beautifully handcrafted Chippendale chair, but you're not necessarily admiring the chisel and the plane and the hammers that went into making it. So the result of this is we have a lot of developers out there now that are writing what I like to call glue code. So bringing together all these disparate elements and joining them together to make that greater whole. It's kind of an exercise of moving the data from API A to API B, with a bit of processing in the middle potentially. But a lot of the heavy lifting is done by the APIs themselves. You know, someone's already solved the processing part for you. You just have to know what to do with the input, what to do with the output. And even the communication between them has largely been boiled down to its essence. If we look at things like JSON, which is a very common format between a lot of these things and reasonably human readable. So it sounds pretty dull, right? Writing glue code for a living? Well, counterintuitively, what we've seen in organisations that I've worked at is that people are more engaged, more driven to write their code, because what they're doing is thinking, I could use that bit and I could use that bit, and what if I ever tried sort of connecting those pieces? So you kind of get that what if scenario, and you get a lot of creative thinking going. And the skill set becomes the ability to sort of know the marketplace, to choose the right tools for the job, and know how to plumb them together. And also, in a sort of very enterprise IT business sense, to know what's got the best uptime and what's got the best pricing model. And that's kind of key to getting execs interested a lot of the time. Now that last factor is incredibly important in enterprise IT. In the majority of businesses, IT is a cost, not a money maker. And so you're constantly year on year driven to drive down your IT costs. So many of these APIs have a free pricing tier, and there's nothing quite like the word free to make your execs and your stakeholders' eyes light up. They like free. But how do we actually put this all together? How do we actually demonstrate the power of these APIs? So one of my former employees, representatives of which are in the room around here somewhere, they needed a health and safety compliance system. The requirements were varied and broad, but again, to kind of recap what I was saying earlier, there's not really that much new under the sun in terms of requirements and business needs. Document uploads, yeah, we've got a component for that. Online forms, yep, done. Saving your work as you're going along and coming back to it later, yep, there's an API or a component for that as well. So you can kind of see the pattern here. It's knowing what you've kind of got out there already and bringing them together. So we built that particular system out on Heroku. It's a developer-centric platform, so it's automatically geared up to kind of expose APIs and gives you a rich marketplace of those various components we talked about. So one of the benefits of this choice is that you've got that modular approach of add-ons. You can very quickly spin up and provision databases, email, NoSQL databases you'll see there, Box, which is our sort of cloud storage system. So all the different bits that you need to bring your system together. For the most part with Heroku, you can certainly find those out there. And for the ones that you can't, it's again open APIs, open standards, allows you to kind of bring in the missing pieces there. So with this example, the volume of traffic was and usage of the system was low enough to qualify for Heroku's free pricing tier. And by repurposing the systems that we kind of already had in place, we actually delivered the system at no additional cost other than developers' time. Now some have actually taken this a step further and taken all these kind of off-the-shelf components and kind of bridged them to a common interface. So we have central repositories now like WebShell, which is an API of APIs. So there's a common means of calling these things. There's a common means of getting the information back out. It's very modular and visual and connectable, which means that your developers can focus on the functionality that they want to deliver, less so than the architecture and the plumbing and the connections between interfaces. And we're working on a system at the moment that has some interfaces to some old legacy systems, and nobody likes writing interfaces, right? It's the most painful part of Salesforce. So here's another spin on APIs. You can write your own. So if you're developing a system, and this is particularly around new go-to-markets, startups, new services that you're presenting out to a developer-focused audience, you want to be able to empower your developers to be able to take that on board and use that functionality, be it for free, be it on a pricing subscription model, whatever your monetization wants to be on that. But again, by publishing that in a standard way with a common accessible way and making it developer friendly, you're going to get that adoption, and it fits into the ecosystem, and you'd be surprised what people will build on top of your platform. And I think the whole API notion is really taking off. When one of our former CEOs at a company I worked at repeatedly used the words API in his business strategy, and this is like sort of central global CEO talking about, you know, a public-facing API for the marketplace. He's not necessarily a techie, but he gets the concept. Hardware APIs. So, you know, we've potentially written code for our Android or iPhones and used the APIs there. But what if the hardware itself was modular and componentized and interchangeable? The API paradigm equally works for hardware as well. If we look at the phone blocks concept by the Dutch designer Dave Hackens as an example of this, phone blocks taps into the notion that your modern smartphone can be broken down into these modular components and swapped in and out to meet your requirements. You want a bigger storage module or a bigger battery, you want a more powerful camera, GPS, faster processor, faster graphics chip. By taking this kind of modular API approach and taking the off-the-shelf components, you can start building that out for hardware too. So the concept suddenly jumps from pure software into hardware. And that makes you think, what else can we do with APIs? Why does it have to be just IT? Why can we not take the approach of modularization, of interoperability, and use it in other sectors? If we look at things like sort of collaboration in the workplace, not just through sort of IT, but just the general fundamental principle of human exchange of information, and establish common standards and common discourse, maybe that's not so far removed from what APIs are all about as well. And we can solve problems in new, more innovative ways by taking that sort of step back and broken down into components module. So there you have it. The development world has kind of moved to a bring your own components, bring your own platform model. So we've gone beyond the bring your own device in the workplace, which in some places never really took off. But certainly from the building perspective, you know, you can bring your knowledge of what's out there, you can bring your knowledge of working with a particular platform or a particular set of tool sets, and tie that together with what you're doing in the enterprise and potentially come up with new and innovative solutions. So it's in your hands now, as the slide says, but remember, it's what you do with it that counts. So I'm going to be brave and offer up the floor to questions. I'm sure there's probably a few kicking about. Like, what's this guy on about? Chris.
What's this guy on about? So earlier you mentioned when you built an app using components that you already had flying around, they'd already been developed. How did you know what had already been developed came out?
In that particular example, I was kind of heading up a hybrid app support, app development team, and I'd been with the company for a while, so I kind of knew the ecosystem internally with the customer. I think the other key piece to that is not just knowing what you've got, but knowing who you've got. Form strategic partnerships across the business, and not just within IT as well. You know, I've in that organisation and in others, you know, through the course of my job of supporting the various departments, I know people in legal, I know people in marketing, HR, and that. I say, what do you guys use for when you want to do this? What solutions have you used to solve that? And I find that out, and then I speak to the IT people and say, who looks after that? And it's, you know, it's conversations that sometimes drive how you do the discovery process. So I think, you know, it's equally knowing your tools as much as knowing your people as well. Mr. Bowden.
You mentioned earlier that you find that your execs get quite interested when something's free.
Yep.
My experience has been the opposite in the main, that large enterprises are really suspicious when something's free. They think it's either going to be low quality, it's not going to be supported, it's going to be problematic. Do you have any advice around how to convince people that free isn't necessarily a bad thing?
Yeah, I think it's a combination. So I think it's metrics. So being able to say, okay, you get this much on this free tier. if you want to go up that, then yes, there is pricing. So you set expectations. I think that's, you know, a general thing with any pitch to execs, but I think particularly around exposing the limitations of the free versus the non-free. And, you know, it's not always the best fit for business. And sometimes, you know, you can't pull it off free. You can pull it off cheap. And, you know, then you start going into the age-old, do you want it fast, cheap, or well done? Because you can't have all three. But I think, you know, in that particular example with Heroku, there was another system in the same organisation. They were looking to analyse mobile spend across the business, so for all the company mobile phones they issued. The vendor provided solution that they were looking at was, I think, about $20,000 a year, and almost but not quite did what they wanted. And they'd have it, well, we can tweak it and configure that, and you can change your business process to fit around the application, and then it'll be fine. The solution we built, we did it on Heroku's free tier again, because the actual network traffic was very low. We had to pay a little bit more for the database storage because we had more database records than the Heroku Postgres database would allow us to have at the free tier. But I think in the end we pulled that in at $9 a month versus the 20 grand a year. So I think, you know, if you've got an exec that's prepared to take that leap of faith, particularly if you can do a proof of concept, and sometimes it requires an investment of your, I wouldn't say out of work time, but you know, you need to kind of squirrel away a little bit of your time to work on this outside of your day job so it doesn't impact it. But I think, you know, if you want to prove that point and you want to kind of garner that trust that actually free can work, or almost free can work, then, you know, having a proof of concept and be able to say, look, here it is practically working and it hasn't cost us a bean. So show and tell is a great way of doing that as well.
Do you think it's easier if it's a freemium model, so you can pay for this if you want to, then free tier?
I think so, yeah. And I think
source and free, they're giving it away.
Yeah, it's a mixture, right? So again, you know, if you start looking at pure open source, you know, despite the great things that open source in general has done in terms of providing quality grade components, there's also a lot of dross out there, but, you know, generally there's some really good stuff out there. Enterprises and large organizations are still a little wary of the open source piece. They just don't seem to believe that you can get something of quality for nothing. So it is a hard sell, I'll give you that. Particularly, you know, I mean, I work in a bank now. It's a regulated industry. They're very risk averse when it comes to security and stuff. I mean, obviously we're in investment. You know, sometimes they're risk averse, sometimes they're not. But yeah, I think, you know, I guess it comes down to know your audience, really. Know what you can sell, know your limitations, but be prepared to go out on a limb a little bit and say, look, this is best of breed. You know, there's large organizations running things on Linux, on Apache, on Kubernetes, and all those other great open source projects. They are far and away the best of breed products, and they're enterprise grade. But on the other hand, you know, some unknown little library that you've got of, you know, cheese.js that no one's ever heard of, you know, you're less likely to get someone to go out on a limb on that. So know your audience, I guess. And if anyone here is actually responsible for maintaining cheese.js, I apologise. It's probably a thing. Yes?
I'm just curious, like all these APIs are like pieces of Legos which we can combine together to build our solution?
To an extent. Again, you know, as the old disclaimer goes, your mileage may vary. I think, you know, a lot of it is down to the quality of not just the contents of what that API is exposing, so the engine behind the API, but also how they've presented that to the world. If they've done it using some, you know, legacy heavyweight SOAP protocol versus a nice lightweight JSON or, you know, REST protocol or something like that, you know, how they present themselves to the world is a big factor as well, because it massively impacts ease of use.
So my question is, like, what is the likelihood of the publisher changing the API, and with that impact or disrupt the solution?
It's highly likely. You know, again, it's you know, the quality ones will publish their API specs. They'll publish what's changed between API versions. I mean, you know, okay, they're not a small player by any stretch of the imagination, but I think, you know, generally, if people are publishing an API, they tend to understand why they're publishing an API, who their audience for that API is, and what their expectations of that audience tend to be. Yes?
It means in that case that fair amount of architecture work will go into this, because knowing the capability of APIs, how you can put them into blocks. So you said one time that you don't need to care about the architecture of the stuff, but when you are getting them all together, you need to invest a good time to get all these APIs together.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying about sort of glue code, really. The shift of focus for development changes from the specific functionality to, I've got the specific functionality, now how can I integrate it into what I'm doing? And again, when we looked at web shells, which is an API of APIs, it's an attempt to bring commonality to that, so you don't necessarily need as much to work out how to integrate these things, because all you need to learn is how do I integrate a web shells component. Okay, so all the web shells components are wrapped in the web shells way of doing things. So underneath, web shells have done that work for you in terms of mapping that API, be it SOAP, be it JSON, REST, whatever standard that the original API publisher's done. And then they've wrapped that in a means where you consistently can use that and know how to use that, how to publish it, how to extract the output. So, it's not a silver bullet for integrating these things. Not everything is going to be in web shells. Not, the API that you want to use may not be covered by that, but it's a damn good start. It's a means of saying, I know how to plug these in. It's, to come back to your sort of Lego blocks piece, you know that those little round circles are going to fit in those little round holes every time.
Well, I can add something to that.
Yeah, sure.
So if you're working in an enterprise and you have different components which are there, you could then start working and set glue code to make a commonality across them.
Yeah.
So you develop, as you said, your own API, which is commonality, and then in future, if you have your service catalog ready, people can just plug and play.
Yeah. So,
in terms of rolling out own API, are there any things we should be avoiding and real bad practices that we shouldn't be doing?
At that level, it's not necessarily a question I can answer. I know that rolling an API is an approach. I haven't done one myself, so I can't really speak to the technicalities of that. But I think learn from the best. So see how others have done it. Stick to common standards. Tend to think about, well, if I was consuming this API, what would I need? How would I want to call it? I think Microsoft, I think, may not necessarily coined the phrase, but they certainly use it a lot, which is eat your own dog food. Okay, if you've published an API that you wouldn't be prepared to use yourself, then you're probably getting it wrong. But the technical specifics, having not ever published an API yet, I say yet, it's a little hard to say.
I suppose on the flip side, then, are there things you've seen in APIs you're trying to consume that you thought this is a bad way of doing it? I
wouldn't necessarily say bad way of doing it. I mean, as I said, some of the protocols used for APIs can be very heavyweight when it's comparatively lightweight protocol, or it hasn't been updated for a while, which is a whole other can of worms, but it means that you're stuck with legacy protocols. APIs are constantly evolving, as are the products that they're exposing, so sometimes you'll find there's feature gaps. So something that that if you were using the tool in isolation you'd be able to do isn't published on the API. It's more of a frustration than anything else. But yeah, I mean that's kind of it comes down to the part about knowing your marketplace, knowing what components work, what don't, engaging with your peers. So we're trying to do. Have you ever tried doing this? What sort of tools did you use for that? Because word of mouth is amongst developers is still one of the most powerful tools out there. Any more for any more? Alrighty. Thanks very much, everyone.